You have got to be kidding me. I mean, you cannot make this up. After years of being told that anyone who even questions Donald Trump's cozy relationship with Russia is a traitor, a deep state plant, or part of some imaginary left-wing conspiracy, we now learn that his own envoy was literally coaching the Kremlin on how to manipulate him. Let that sink in. This isn't speculation. This isn't rumor. This is a leaked call involving Steve Witkoff, the man Trump himself put in charge of sensitive Ukraine negotiations, walking Moscow through how to pitch a deal to Trump in a way that would work on him. And now, even Republicans are recoiling in open disgust. Even they can't pretend this is normal anymore. And honestly, if you are watching this and feeling like you're taking crazy pills, you are not alone. Because we were told over and over that Trump was the tough-on-Russia guy, strongman, master negotiator. And now we find out that his own representative was effectively assisting the Kremlin in shaping a proposal for Trump's approval. That's not hardline diplomacy. That's not deal-making. That is a national security nightmare. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. This is not some abstract policy disagreement. This is not merely a difference of opinion on how to end the war in Ukraine. This is an American envoy, handpicked by Trump, allegedly helping the Kremlin fine-tune a strategy to sell Trump a deal that benefits Russia. They are saying the quiet part out loud. And the reaction inside Trump's own party tells you everything you need to know.
We're talking about senior Republicans, people who have bent over backwards for Trump for nearly a decade, now openly calling this plan a Russian wish list. Mitch McConnell, the guy who carried water for Trump through impeachment after impeachment, is now publicly warning about rewarding Russian aggression. Roger Wicker, who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee, is saying this proposal is deeply dangerous. These are not radical leftists. These are Trump's own people. And they are effectively saying this is not just wrong, this is reckless. Make no mistake, the reason this feels so jarring is because it strips away the last layer of plausible deniability. For years, Trump and his allies have hidden behind ambiguity. You can't prove intent. You're reading too much into it. It's just diplomacy. But when a leak shows Trump's own envoy actively helping Moscow structure its message for Trump, that ambiguity collapses. The mask comes off, and suddenly the GOP, at least part of it, realizes what many of us have been screaming for years. This is not about peace. This is about power, ego, and surrender disguised as deal-making. And here's the most damning part. This wasn't exposed by Democrats. It wasn't uncovered by some left-wing activist group. It came from reporting, from leaked communications, from people who were in the room. The receipts are there. You don't get to hide behind vibes anymore. You don't get to gaslight your way out of a leaked phone call. This isn't politics. This is gaslighting on an international scale. For years, we were told Trump was defending American strength. Now we see American diplomacy being used as a tool for Russian leverage. And now even Republicans are being forced to confront it in real time. And that is why this moment matters. Because for the first time in a long time, Trump is not just being contradicted by Democrats, he is being unmasked by his own party.
And that brings us to the part they don't want you to focus on. How this happened, who enabled it, and why the consequences could be catastrophic. Here is the reality that Trump doesn't want you to see. The details of this leak are not vague. They are not fuzzy. They are not open to interpretation. According to the reporting, this was a direct call between Steve Witkoff and a senior Kremlin advisor. Not a rumor, not a third-hand briefing, a call. And on that call, Witkoff wasn't pushing back on Russia's demands. He wasn't drawing red lines. He wasn't saying, here's what the United States requires. He was instead explaining how Russia should frame its proposal so that Trump would find it appealing. That is not diplomacy. That is coaching the opposing side. That is assisting a foreign adversary in manipulating the president of the United States. Let that sink in for a second. We're not talking about a translator. We're not talking about a neutral go-between. We're talking about the person Trump personally empowered to represent American interests in negotiations over the most consequential war in Europe since World War II. And that person was effectively saying, here's how you pitch this to him, so Phil, buy it. And now let's talk about what that pitch actually contained, because this is where the whole thing collapses under its own absurdity. The so-called peace framework floating around is loaded with concessions, and guess who they all benefit? Russia. Ukraine is expected to give up land. Ukraine is expected to pull back militarily. Ukraine is expected to abandon key security aspirations. And Russia? Russia gets relief, legitimacy, and time to regroup. This is not a compromise. This is a wish list. And that's not me saying it. That is Republican senators saying it out loud.
Now, here's where the hypocrisy gets exposed in high definition. For years, Trump has portrayed himself as the only thing standing between America and foreign domination. Tough on China, tough on Iran, tough on everybody. And yet, when it comes to Russia, suddenly it's all about empathy, understanding, concessions, and trust. Suddenly, we're not supposed to be confrontational. Suddenly, we're supposed to be realistic. Give me a break, because if you are tough on enemies, you don't send an envoy who helps your enemy tailor messaging to manipulate you. That is not strength. That is susceptibility. That is not leverage. That is vulnerability. And it gets worse, because when news of this leak breaks, what does Trump do? Does he deny the authenticity of the call? No. Does he release a transcript? No. Does he demonstrate that Witkoff was misquoted? No. Instead, we get deflection. We get attacks on the media. We get complaints about leaks rather than explanations of the behavior being leaked. Classic. Attack the messenger, avoid the message. They are saying the quiet part out loud. The problem isn't what happened. The problem is that we found out. Now, follow the logic line by line. Trump appoints a personal friend, not a career diplomat, not a Senate-confirmed official, to handle one of the most sensitive geopolitical negotiations of our time. That friend operates largely outside traditional diplomatic channels. That friend engages Russian officials directly. A call leaks showing that friend coaching the Russian side on how to sell Trump a deal. And Trump's response is silence on the substance. If this were a Democratic president, any Democrat, Republicans would be screaming treason in all caps 24/7. They would be calling for congressional investigations, special counsels, emergency hearings. Fox News would be running wall-to-wall coverage with graphics saying betrayal. But now they suddenly want nuance. Now they suddenly want us to wait for the full context. Funny how that works.
Make no mistake, this didn't happen in a vacuum. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was enabled. Enabled by a political culture that has spent years excusing, downplaying, and rationalizing Trump's alignment with authoritarian leaders. Enabled by a party media ecosystem that trained its audience to distrust any warning as fake news. So when something very real finally breaks through, they don't know how to respond. And that explains the shock you're seeing on Capitol Hill right now, because the senators criticizing this aren't reacting to a policy they disagree with. They're reacting to a level of exposure that makes denial impossible. You can argue about strategy. You can't argue with a leaked call. Here's the other piece that demolishes the defense. Trump has always insisted that only he can deliver peace because he's such an incredible negotiator. But if you are the master dealmaker, why does the Kremlin need coaching on how to sell you a proposal? Think about that. If you truly have the upper hand, you don't need the opposing side to be taught how to manipulate you. The very existence of that coaching suggests the opposite, that Trump is being worked, not the other way around. And honestly, it's pathetic. This image of the invincible strongman collapses the moment it requires a foreign power to be walked through Trump's psychological weak spots. This isn't chess. This is emotional leverage. This is flattery. This is ego manipulation. And now we have reporting that suggests exactly that dynamic is in play. And then there's the GOP reaction itself, because that's the smoking gun that this isn't just partisan spin. When figures who have spent years defending Trump start using phrases like dangerous, reckless, and rewarding aggression, that tells you the internal alarms are blaring. These are people who know exactly how intelligence briefings work. They understand how back-channel diplomacy is supposed to operate, and they see the same thing you and I see, an American envoy crossing a line that should never be crossed.
Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. This isn't a disagreement about how fast to end the war. This is about who benefits from ending it on these terms. Because if the outcome is territorial loss for Ukraine, strategic victory for Russia, and a weakened NATO, that is not peace. That is the rebranding of defeat. And now ask yourself this: why has Trump spent years attacking NATO? Why has he spent years praising Vladimir Putin? Why has he spent years undermining U.S. alliances? And now suddenly we discover that his own envoy is helping Russia shape a deal. This isn't random. This is continuity. This is alignment. But wait, because it gets worse. The implications of this call reach far beyond Ukraine. If a U.S. envoy can privately assist a hostile foreign power in messaging to the president, then the entire premise of American diplomatic leverage collapses. Allies begin to question whether negotiations with the United States are secure. Adversaries begin to test how far the manipulation can go. And the president becomes not the driver of policy, but the target of influence operations. And that brings us to the real inflection point. Because once that threshold is crossed, once foreign manipulation becomes baked into the mechanism of U.S. diplomacy, the damage doesn't stop with one war. It metastasizes across everything: trade, security, intelligence sharing, alliance credibility. Every adversary is watching how this plays out. Every ally is recalculating risk. And that is the forensic reality of this moment. Not vibes, not speculation. The chain of events is clear. The call happened, the content leaked, the GOP backlash erupted, the concessions favor Russia, the White House offered deflection instead of denial. That is the factual backbone of what we're dealing with. And once you see that chain clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. Is this an isolated failure or part of a much larger pattern? This is not an isolated failure. This is a pattern. And once you recognize the pattern, everything about this moment snaps into focus with terrifying clarity. Because this is not the first time Trump's orbit has bent toward authoritarian interests. It's just the first time it's been exposed this cleanly, in the middle of an act of war, with his own party forced to admit it out loud. Let's zoom out. Remember how all of this started. Back in 2016, when U.S. intelligence agencies unanimously concluded that Russia interfered in the election to benefit Donald Trump, Trump didn't treat that as an attack on American democracy. He treated it as a personal insult. He publicly sided with Vladimir Putin over U.S. intelligence. He stood on a global stage and said he trusted Putin's word more than his own country's experts. That wasn't a gaffe. That was a signal. Then came the purge of national security officials who wouldn't bend. FBI directors fired, intelligence briefers sidelined, career diplomats pushed out. Anyone who insisted on treating Russia like an adversary was labeled part of the deep state, and anyone willing to indulge Trump's ego about Putin was rewarded. That wasn't chaos, that was selection pressure. Over time, only the loyalists survive, not to the Constitution, not to U.S. security doctrine, but to Trump personally. Fast forward to the first impeachment. Trump withholds military aid to Ukraine, aid specifically designed to deter Russian aggression while pressuring Ukraine to help him politically. The message to foreign governments was crystal clear. If you help Trump, Trump will help you. If you don't, you get punished. That wasn't about foreign policy, that was about transactional loyalty.
And even after being impeached for that exact behavior, what happened? The Republican Party closed ranks. They didn't say this crossed a line. They said perfect phone call. They normalized it. They trained their base to treat abuse of power as just another partisan skirmish. That moment mattered because it taught Trump a dangerous lesson. There is no bottom. There is no red line his party will enforce. At least, that's what he believed. Then came the years of public praise. Trump praising Putin as smart, Trump attacking NATO as obsolete, Trump threatening to abandon allies if they didn't pay up. Over and over, the same pattern repeated. Undermine U.S. alliances, flatter authoritarian leaders, weaken multilateral pressure. And every time critics warned that this was destabilizing global security, they were shouted down as hysterical.
Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. Diplomacy works because of credibility. Allies trust that when the United States commits to something, it means something. Adversaries fear consequences. Trump systematically corroded both sides of that equation. He replaced predictability with personal impulse. He replaced institutional memory with gut instinct. And in that vacuum, foreign powers learned exactly how to work him, praise him, flatter him, frame proposals as personal victories. So now we arrive at the current moment, where an envoy personally chosen by Trump is caught allegedly helping Russia fine-tune how to sell him a deal. And suddenly the through line becomes impossible to ignore. This is not a deviation. This is the logical endpoint of a decade-long erosion of diplomatic norms. Because when you repeatedly signal that you admire authoritarians, that you distrust your own institutions, that you prioritize personal loyalty over national interest, eventually people will take you at your word. Eventually, adversaries will stop guessing and start exploiting.
And here's the part Trump's defenders desperately want you to miss. This isn't about ideology. Putin doesn't care whether Trump is conservative or liberal. What he cares about is leverage. And Trump, through ego, grievance, and a constant hunger for validation, has made himself unusually easy to leverage. Think about how this dynamic works psychologically. Trump craves being seen as powerful, as feared, as respected by strong men. So when an adversary frames a concession as a validation of his dominance, it lands. When they present a giveaway as a historic deal only you could achieve, it bypasses institutional caution and hits straight at ego. That's not strategy. That's emotional manipulation. And now, for the first time, we're seeing Republicans who spent years pretending this wasn't happening finally forced to confront its consequences in real time. Because this time, the pattern didn't just produce rhetoric. It produced a paper trail. It produced a leaked call. It produced a framework that reads like Moscow's opening bid. And here's the part that should keep every American up at night. If this can happen with Russia and Ukraine, with the eyes of the world watching, what's happening in the shadows on other fronts? Trade negotiations, sanctions enforcement, intelligence sharing agreements, arms sales. Every one of those domains depends on the assumption that U.S. representatives are advocating for U.S. interests. The moment that assumption becomes questionable, the entire machinery of state power begins to wobble. Make no mistake, authoritarian regimes don't operate in silos. They watch each other. They learn from each other. If Moscow sees that access to Trump's circle yields tangible concessions, Beijing is watching, Tehran is watching, Riyadh is watching. The lesson isn't, the U.S. is unpredictable. The lesson is, the U.S. is influenceable if you play the man instead of the nation.
And let's talk about the GOP's role in enabling this pattern, because this didn't happen by accident. It happened because institutional guardrails were deliberately dismantled, oversight was weakened, loyalty tests replaced qualification standards, expertise was recast as suspicion, and whenever a warning bell rang, the party base was trained to boo the alarm instead of asking why it was ringing. For years, Republican leaders treated Trump's Russia posture as politically inconvenient, but strategically survivable. He talks tough domestically, they said. He's unpredictable internationally, they said. The problem is that unpredictability is not deterrence. It's an invitation for manipulation. And now that manipulation is no longer hypothetical, it's documented. They are saying the quiet part out loud now, not because they suddenly grew spines, but because the evidence became impossible to sanitize. When the call leaks, when the concessions are spelled out, when the envoy's role becomes there in black and white, suddenly the talking points fail. Suddenly the whispers in closed-door briefings become public statements. And here's the tragic irony. The same Republicans now warning about this danger spent years insulating Trump from accountability when accountability might have stopped it. The impeachment over Ukraine aid, the constant attacks on intelligence officials, the defense of every pro-Putin remark, all of it built the runway that led directly to this moment. This is what it can't happen here thinking produces, a slow normalization of the unthinkable until the unthinkable becomes administrative routine. And that's the real pattern, not chaos, not randomness, normalization through repetition. Once you normalize siding with dictators over allies, the next step becomes easier. Once you normalize attacking your own intelligence agencies, the next step becomes easier. And eventually you reach the point where an American envoy allegedly coaching the Kremlin is no longer treated as unimaginable, only inconvenient. And that's why the current backlash feels so jagged, because it's less a moral awakening and more a systemic jolt. The machine didn't expect to see its own wiring exposed like this. It expected plausible deniability. It expected narrative control. It didn't expect a direct window into the mechanics of influence. But the window is open now, and once opened, it can't be closed by press releases or talking points, because now the question isn't just, did this happen? The question becomes, how many times has something like this already happened without getting caught? If you are watching this and feeling a growing sense of dread, that reaction is not hysteria. It is diagnostic clarity. You are seeing a system that slowly traded institutional resilience for personal loyalty and is now shocked that the result looks like institutional vulnerability. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of all. Because once a pattern like this takes root, it doesn't self-correct automatically. It only stops when power, incentives, and accountability realign. And right now, those forces are still badly skewed. Which leads to the unavoidable next question, the one that this entire episode points toward with chilling urgency. What happens to American democracy, to global security, to the post-World War II order itself, if this behavior is not just exposed, but allowed to continue? That's the endgame. What happens is not abstract, it's not theoretical, it's not some far-off civics textbook scenario. It's immediate, it's structural, and it is dangerous in ways that don't show up in a single headline, but reshape the world quietly, incrementally, and then all at once. Because here's the terrifying reality once you strip away the spectacle. When a president of the United States becomes predictably influenceable, American power stops being deterrent power and becomes negotiable power. And once U.S. power is negotiable, every authoritarian regime on Earth recalculates its risk. They stop asking, what will the United States do, and start asking, what does this president want to hear?
Make no mistake. Deterrence depends on the perception that consequences are automatic, not personal, not moody, not dependent on flattery. Automatic, rules-based, institutional. The moment those consequences start hinging on ego management instead of law, deterrence collapses. And when deterrence collapses, conflict doesn't end. It metastasizes. Let's talk about Ukraine for a second, because this is where the human cost of all this abstraction meets the ground. If Ukraine is pressured into territorial surrender under these conditions, it tells every aggressor state on the planet one thing. Invasions work. You just have to wait long enough and manipulate the right leader. That is the lesson written in blood. That doesn't end wars. That accelerates the next one. And look at NATO. NATO functions because its members believe that Article 5 means something real, not just a press release, not just a talking point. But when the President of the United States openly treats alliances like protection rackets and dictators like negotiating partners, trust evaporates. Countries don't abandon alliances overnight. They hedge silently. They build their own redundancies. They seek their own guarantees. And that fragmentation is how collective security dies without a dramatic explosion. Here's the reality that Trump's defenders don't want you to see. America doesn't lose power in a single scandal. It loses it in credibility erosion, the slow drip of doubt, the quiet recalibration in foreign ministries, the internal memos that stop assuming U.S. follow-through and start planning around U.S. volatility. And once that shift completes, it doesn't reverse when the next administration comes in. Trust takes decades to build and seconds to destroy. Now let's turn the lens inward, because the stakes aren't just global, they're domestic. Once the American public becomes conditioned to the idea that foreign powers can influence U.S. decision-making through personal access rather than institutional process, democracy itself becomes negotiable. And once democracy becomes negotiable, elections stop being the final word and start becoming one variable among many.
That's not hyperbole, that's how democratic backsliding works across history. Institutions hollow out long before banners fall. Accountability becomes selective. Law becomes contingent. Loyalty replaces legitimacy, and eventually the power of the office eclipses the limits that once defined it.
This is why the GOP mutiny matters so profoundly, not because it guarantees accountability, but because it shows how far the system had to bend before resistance became unavoidable. When even longtime party loyalists can't pretend this is normal anymore, what they're really saying is that the institutional damage has crossed an internal threshold, not a moral one, a structural one. And here's the most sobering part. Exposure alone does not equal correction. Scandals don't fix systems, only consequences do. Only enforcement does. Only sustained public refusal to normalize the unacceptable does. We've been taught to treat every outrage as an isolated episode, another headline, another controversy, another news cycle. But this isn't episodic. It's architectural. It's about how decisions are made, who influences them, and whether the American state still belongs to institutions or to personal networks. Because once personal networks replace institutions at the highest level, the republic becomes fragile in ways the Constitution alone cannot prevent. No law can protect a system whose cultural immune response has been exhausted. No statute can substitute for a citizenry that refuses to accept gaslighting as governance. They are saying the quiet part out loud now, not because the danger just appeared, but because it finally became visible enough to fracture denial. And visibility is only the first step. The harder step is sustained vigilance when the spectacle fades and the next distraction arrives. So here is the call to vigilance. Not panic, not despair. Vigilance. Demand substance over spin. Demand process over personality. Demand institutional accountability, not partisan loyalty. Because the real threat here is not Russia alone. It's not one envoy. It's not even one president.
The real threat is the normalization of influence without consent, power without process, and authority without consequence. And honestly, that's how democracies don't end in coups. They end in shrugs. They end in, well, that's just how it is now. They end when enough people decide dysfunction is just the new baseline. If you are feeling unsettled right now, that's not fear-mongering. That's awareness. You are watching a stress test of American democracy in real time, not through tanks in the streets, but through a quiet erosion of guardrails that once made abuse harder, slower, riskier. What determines the future from here is not whether this one episode shocks the system. It's whether the system is finally forced to reassert itself. Because the most dangerous outcome is not exposure without consequence. The most dangerous outcome is exposure followed by resignation. And that's the line we cannot afford to cross.